It's very much my pleasure to introduce our first speaker of the panel, Professor James Moore from the Ohio State University. I think they trademarked it, right? So Professor Moore is a philologist and social historian of the ancient Near East and ancient Mediterranean. He has been working also on a number of European projects, including a collaborator on the ERC project, Slave Agents, Enslaved Persons in the Making of Societies and Cultures in Western Eurasia. But long prior to that, you had also been very much connected to a project at École Pratique des Hautes Études, as I believe, having spoken with you before. He publishes broadly on ancient Near Eastern studies, but has also edited quite literally hundreds of new Northwest Semitic documents in a range of languages, including Aramaic, Phoenician, and Hebrew, written on ancient Hebrew and Aramaic literatures, and publishes frequently on social history and scribal culture, and advocates really for the incorporation of digital resources in the study of languages and cultures. His many books, I will spare time and say that they are both fantastic and numerous, and actually jump to the more interesting part, which is to welcome James up for his talk for us today, Propositions for the Direction of the Historical Interpretation of Biblical Literature, Examples from Achaemenid Cultural Allusions in the Book of Esther.
Thank you, Gina, and thank you, Professors Shayagan and Shnidawin in particular, for the invitation. I'm happy to be here. I think this conference is perhaps addresses what is, I think, the most important topic in biblical studies, and that is what is happening in the Achaemenid period. If we think that the Hebrew Bible is coming together in the Achaemenid period, then why not understand it and understand it clearly? And to that end, I will begin with what for me is essentially a problem I've had over the years. And this is a quote here that I've encountered in various forms, in various conferences that Bible scholars have given me. When asked, how do you know what you're talking about in terms of these Persian period texts, they often say, well, that's not what we know of the Persian period, and this is how we know it, and this is what we do. And we'll come back to what this means in a second. My objective in this talk is to challenge biblical scholarship to take seriously the historical investigation of the Achaemenid period, to recognize the biblical evidence as foremost literary and not historical, to go beyond the circular reasoning that most Bible scholars employ, which is it's in Ezra and Nehemiah, so that's the Persian period. And also to explore with historical rigor the Persian period evidence, particularly the documentary sources, the boring stuff, and to go beyond the few sources from the Persian period that are often cited. Normally the few literary sources, Ahikar's, Sheikh Fadl, or the propagandistic letter items such as the Yadanya letter. And to especially go beyond Herodotus, because while he's very important in a number of ways, his understanding of the Persian administration is sorely lacking when it's compared to the actual evidence on the ground. And then my procedure is always to deduce social historical moments using the documentary sources that can then serve as controls for social allusions found in the biblical literature. So that's the objective. Let me start with talking about the Book of Esther. Ideally, I would have probably picked a few other texts, but the invitation was for Esther, and so I was very happy to really explore Esther in a way that I had never done before. So I've narrowed the talk down to a few points. First, we'll talk about ethnicity in Esther, since this is a central plot element and in one way or another a moral in the tale. I'll address a little bit about its use, the book's use of royal settings, and compare it to the shifting political landscape of the 4th century. And then also a brief discussion about the obsession Esther has with fashion and the larger paper, I'll go in more of a commentative style and just reflect on how the Achaemenid administration in particular can be echoed or seen or misinterpreted in different passages. So, ethnicity plays a role in the plot. This is clear. Most biblical scholars have written on this and recognized this. One of the main characters, Mordecai, is presented as both a Judean and a Benjaminite. And then the antagonist is presented with his ethnicity, that is an Agagite. Biblical scholarship has argued that this is actually inspired by an episode in the life of Saul. I have no reason to doubt that it is. No problem with that. It sort of explains a literary feature of the text. But what about these interchanging ethnicities, and what in the world is happening with ethnicity in the Persian period? And how do we interpret these from a historical perspective? Well, to begin, let's begin with the biblical mainline idea of ethnicity. And I think John Levinson's statement on this is both a synthesis to the moment that he wrote this, but also the working idea as 30 years on, here we are. And he says, in the Hebrew Bible, the term Yehudi, Jew, applied to Mordecai, usually denotes a member of the tribe of Judah. And then he goes into the Talmud, because the Talmud's trying to deal with the fact that there are multiple ethnicities here and what that means. At the level of plain sense, however, these harmonistic and homiletical Talmudic explanations fail. What actually happens, what we know of the Persian period, is that in the wake of the exile of the only tribal unit still intact, Judah, the ethnic term Yehudi came to refer to any Israelite. Hence our translation Jew rather than Judahite. Mordecai was a Jew because he comes from Judah, the last commonwealth of the people of Israel, before the exile, and lives in the community of Jewish exiles in Susa. He's a Benjaminite because Benjamin was his ancestral affiliation, and he nicely deduces that Yehudi is a post-exilic innovation. Levinson's view is certainly circular in the fact that it relies on notions of biblical historiography, whether stated or not, and therefore lacks the historical rigor that I think that we can employ given the large amount of textual evidence we have. That said, Levinson is a brilliant scholar, and so he, in his literary style, did recognize that there is some sort of innovation happening here with ethnicity. So let me summarize from a number of studies what I see happening in the Persian period with the notion of ethnicity. So, perhaps beginning in the provincial experiments of the Neo-Babylonian period, but certainly fine-tuned in the Persian period, ethnicity was deterritorialized on a large scale. No longer did ethnicity come to mean solely a geographical identifier, but due to the dismantling of major Western kingdoms and their administrative restructuring into provinces, ethnicity shifted from primarily a geographical identifier to primarily a community identifier. These communities, at least in the Egyptian province and the Anatolian province, were administrative units organized around temples, which became recognized taxable entities regardless of their location. Ethnicity became foremost an administrative construction. You're a Judean because the Persians tell you you're a Judean. And the recognizable community unit of Judean carried a real and meaningful value, economically speaking, relative other and socially, relative other recognized communities in the Persian, and then also continuing into the Ptolemaic periods. That was a mouthful. As a recognized community, the evidence suggests that the Judeans received special incentives as Persian loyalists and also as Ptolemaic residents. At least in the Egyptian province, these communities were organized around temples. And a notion of religion as a system and cultural and cultic values, that is, community laws, began to develop on a large scale. In this way, the Persian administration inadvertently was the catalyst for the development of mass-scale cultural religion as we have come to understand it. The Judeans had to self-identify on the community, that is, the temple level, to the state. And thus the question, what is a Judean, became an intercultural question prompted by Persian administrative recognition and fought out among Judean leaders who were likely attempting to control or consolidate the economic advantages offered to these different communities. This sociological structure provides, in my opinion, the justification for why the Bible comes together in the Persian period anyways, and why the various Judean voices in it are echoed. But in these intercultural fights, which were based on real-life politicizing of ethnicity, Judeans began to evoke ethnic terms from their past as intercultural identifiers of distinction. Thus, Israelite Judean was invented and became a moniker for some leading Judean communities. So too, Hebrew rather than Aramaic or Greek was a cultural marker for certain Judean communities also. Note, though, that this is flipping the script when you look at the evidence. The idea that there was an Israelite in Judah and that this was a leading ethnic identity is somewhat I have no evidence for this, first of all, historically speaking, and secondly, it lacks common sense, I think. But that's the standard direction of the conversation in biblical scholarship. Why then did Mordecai instruct Esther not to tell the royal court that she was a Judean? And what do we do with these double ethnicities? This is a big problem in the scholarship of Esther. I'll give you two possible options from my sort of historical reading of this. So, first of all, it's assumed that Mordecai identified as something other than a Judean. Evidence from Elephantine contracts show that Judeans would frequently self-identify or identify peers as Arameans when in the presence of the imperial administration or Eastern notaries, that is, the higher level Medes and Babylonians. There's also evidence that changing one's ethnonym was a common practice in the Ptolemaic period. Again, it goes back to the hunt for good tax advantages. So that's the first possibility. They just identified as something else. The other option goes really into a Hellenistic interpretation, and this plot element is a Hellenistic misimpression of the Persian use of the ethnonyms. The Ptolemies adopted the Persian imperial taxation structure, but in the Ptolemaic administrative concept of ethnoi, which they introduced, it's very important to remember that your ethnicity was not your ethnonym, but rather your professional title. So you are not a Judean foremost, but you're a teacher or a doctor or a soldier. They adopted as a legacy factor into their system the Persian taxation model of organizing people by ethnonyms, and then they consolidated this into a handful of those, mostly Persian, Judean, and Arab. And they all received great tax advantages, which is sort of represented up here on this tax list, where this simplification, though, of giving tax advantages only escalated the problem of who was a Judean, as many would desire to identify as a Judean for these advantages. But the point is that Mordecai could have just been assumed to be identified by his professional class rather than his ethnicity. And then the Hebrew version is playing on this. Either way, hiding one's ethnicity was a plot element, but not at all surprising or problematic in an ancient context in the Persian period or in the Ptolemaic period. So, moving beyond ethnicity, I wanted to propose a second proposition, and that is that the shifting political landscape of the 4th century was very, very significant in our understanding and interpretation of the Hebrew Bible. Let me just give you a quick rundown of the timeline. In 404, the Persians lose Egypt with the popular revolts of Amitreus. Now, Amitreus seems to have continued to use the Persian Aramaic administration for at least 5 years until Nefertiti's takes over after his death. And it seems to be that Aramaic then stops overnight. In reality, it was probably a little bit of a gradual change, but for the first time since the Persians in 125 years, now Egypt can be independent again. In the 4th century, we also have the emergence of the Idumea ostraca, which may have been seen, and Lemaire is, I think, correct, this is at least a major point of it, that the Persians initiated the administrative oversight of the Idumea region because this is now their southern boundary, and it's the boundary with the rebellious Egypt that they want back. So it makes complete sense. The problem, though, is that you end up with other incursions on these boundaries, in particular the Kedarites, who are a shifty group of encroaching Arabs who come to great power very quickly and become problematic from a Persian point of view. The 4th century also attests, though, to a major investment in Tyre on the Persian Mediterranean coast. For example, the site of Tel Kadesh is a massive administrative complex, absolutely not religious at all from the archaeological record, and this is the exact kind of sort of small Persepolis that you would expect to find in these kinds of provincial settings. Then, in 343, we start the second Persian period of Egypt, and I think this was a very important moment in understanding the cultural history of the region, and the Judeans played a major role in this reoccupation of Egypt. And then Alexander comes in, and Alexander's conquest shows the deterioration of the political structure, but not of the administrative structure. Alexander seems to have just basically maintained the Persian administration until the Ptolemies will eventually evolve it into a simplified system that serves their purposes. So, if we think about this shifting shifting political landscape and Esther, we can also then consider the evidence from Persepolis that suggests that perhaps also Susa housed rare and regal accoutrement from throughout the empire. That said, what's interesting is most of the descriptions are rather vague or things that you would expect in any palatial setting or in palatial settings that have a legendary tradition of what a Persian setting would look like. And it's important to remember, by the way, that in the royal roads you have all sorts of Persian influence. But what's fascinating in Esther is the few things that really stand out, call to mind the Phoenician world a bit more than the Persian world. So for instance, this notion of the color blue or purple, whether it's Egyptian blue or purple from the murex, which can be interchanged in the words, it doesn't matter. The Phoenicians were the catalysts or the interlocutors for the trade network from Egypt anyways. And so this calls to mind what's happening in the 4th century in the Levant. The emphasis on drinking at Persian banquets, the mishteh, rather than feasting, that is the Persian royal table ceremony that you might expect, brings to mind interference with the very famous Marzeach, which the Judeans are clearly partaking in their temple settings, and is a pan-Canaanite and probably larger Mediterranean festival, which is why I feel comfortable giving you Hercules here as a visual. And so these kinds of things are really specific to the Phoenician control of the Persian Levantine coast. The details of the Persian royal banquet do not indicate any specific feature of Susa as far as I can tell. and features that can't have been, as was said earlier, just learned. There's no reason to assume then, in my reading, a first-hand account of Susa by any author, though, of course, you have foreigners all over these courts. That's what the high-class officials in the region would have gone to Elam. That's the statement to go pay your labor tax and do your service. So, and we have the reliefs that show foreigners there, but we also have that foreigner-led teams of foreigners, that is, local people into Susa, for instance. This we have an inscription from Susa that talks about this. In fact, the obsession with the Persian courtly setting and its culture, though, supports the idea that the text was not written in a Persian city. That is, why would they obsess over these details if they're in the middle of it? And this brings me to my final point, and that is the Achaemenid program was very meticulous about enculturating its provinces with a sense of Persian culture. And so I call this the cultural revolution of the Achaemenid program. Fashion and celebrity and courtly behavior are clearly in focus in the Book of Esther. What we know from the Egyptian evidence is that Judeans were a conduit for promoting Persian culture through their loyalist settlements, particularly at Elephantine. Things like fashion are both in the archaeological record, and you read the archaeological reports, everyone knows when the Persian period exists because these objects are new. And after Nefertites, they're gone. And things like fashion, but also in the textual documents where they're talking about Persian sandals and garments and things. In addition, the Persians brought food and culture to Egypt that wasn't there before. The olives, the cucumbers, and with it a mode of irrigation and public works facilitation that Egypt had never known, how to reorganize especially the upper parts of the Nile into productive agriculture. And then, of course, once you then get to I end with the administrative language because this is shaping the thinking of the people living in the region. So, what then do we have? Through the administrative prowess, the Persians took an evolving and experimental system and turned it into a well-tuned bureaucratic machine. I mean, this was the largest and most powerful empire in the ancient world, and it lasted a long time, and its administration ran on its own, even without kings at times. Whether we date Esther to the end of the Persian period or to the Ptolemaic period, the remnants of Persian bureaucracy, when understood in their historical context, can shape our interpretation of its literary features. Doing this can put to rest some of these long-standing debates quite quickly, I think, that biblical scholars have fought over, ethnicity and things, but also open the doors to deeper lines of inquiry. What then does ethnicity mean and do in Esther if you're dealing with this complex social environment? And for this talk, I'll go ahead and stop it there. Thank you.